George Smith Patton Jr. died on 21st December 1945, but the legend he left behind would shape his family for generations. His widow Beatrice and their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, suddenly found themselves living in the shadow of one of America's most celebrated and controversial military figures. The general who had led the Third Army across Europe, who had relieved Bastogne in the war's darkest hour, who had been feared by his enemies and occasionally by his allies, was gone. But for the Patton family, the weight of that name was only beginning to be felt. What followed were decades of military service, personal tragedy, public scrutiny, and an ongoing struggle to honour a legacy while forging individual identities. The circumstances of Patton's death were as unexpected as they were mundane. On the morning of 9th December 1945, just months after Germany's surrender and the day before he was scheduled to fly home to the United States, Patton set out on a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany. He was riding in the back seat of a 1938 Cadillac Model 75 limousine with his Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart "Hap" Gay. His driver was 19-year-old Private First Class Horace Woodring of Kentucky, who had been assigned to the general only a few months earlier after Patton's longtime driver, Master Sergeant John L. Mims, had returned home from the service. The morning was grey and cold. Patton, who had survived some of the fiercest fighting of the war, was commenting on the debris and wreckage still visible along the roadsides, the litter that war had left behind. As one account described it, at approximately 11:45 in the morning, as the Cadillac travelled along Highway 38 near a quartermaster depot on the outskirts of Mannheim, disaster struck. A 2.5-ton Army GMC truck driven by Technical Sergeant Robert L. Thompson suddenly turned left into the driveway of the depot, directly into the path of Patton's limousine. Woodring had no time to avoid the collision. The impact threw Patton forward. His head struck the partition separating the front and rear compartments, gashing his forehead and breaking his neck. Gay and Woodring escaped with minor injuries. But Patton, who was not wearing a seatbelt, they were uncommon in that era, lay paralysed from the neck down. He knew immediately what had happened. According to witnesses, his first words were a grim assessment of his condition. He told Gay to rub his fingers, testing for sensation that would not come. The general, who had always led from the front, who had demanded his soldiers never stop advancing, could no longer move. The news of Patton's accident sent shockwaves through the military establishment and beyond. Beatrice Patton, who had been at her daughter's home in Washington preparing for her husband's first Christmas at home in 4 years, received word from an Associated Press reporter. Within hours, she was on an emergency flight to Germany, accompanied by Colonel Roy Glenwood Sperling, a renowned neurosurgeon who had been pulled off a train to Kentucky and flown to Washington to join her. The military spared no effort in getting the general's wife to his bedside. General Dwight D. Eisenhower personally issued orders to find the very fastest transportation for Big B, as Beatrice was known within the family. Beatrice arrived at the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg on 11th December. She found her husband paralysed but conscious, his famous fighting spirit still flickering. When Colonel Sperling, speaking to Patton man to man, confirmed that he would never ride a horse again, the general absorbed the news with characteristic bluntness. He understood that the best he could hope for would be semi-invalidism, as he put it. He thanked the doctor for being honest and promised to be a good patient. For the next 11 days, Beatrice remained at her husband's bedside. The medical staff worked desperately to stabilize him, but his condition deteriorated. Edema built up in his lungs, a blood clot formed in his paralyzed body and began its journey toward his heart. On the evening of 21st December 1945, at 5:55 p.m., George S. Patton Jr. died in his sleep. He was 60 years old. His death came just 4 days after his birthday and 4 days before Christmas. The question of where to bury him arose immediately. Beatrice's first instinct was to bring her husband's body home to the United States for burial at West Point. But she knew better than anyone what Patton himself would have wanted. The general had always been contemptuous of the practice of repatriating fallen soldiers, once calling it catering to a bunch of snivelling sob sisters retained by those carrion-eating ghouls, the coffin makers and undertakers. When General Eisenhower's staff gently suggested that Patton should rest among the soldiers of his beloved Third Army, Beatrice understood at once. "Of course he must be buried here," she said. "Furthermore, I know George would want to lie beside the men of his army who have fallen." She chose the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Ham, where thousands of Third Army soldiers who had died in the Battle of the Bulge were interred. The burial took place on Christmas Eve 1945. A funeral train carried Patton's body from Heidelberg to Luxembourg, a journey of 240 miles that took 13 hours. At every stop along the way, crowds gathered to pay their respects, including many German civilians, former enemies who stood bareheaded in tribute to the general who had defeated them. Beatrice, displaying the fortitude that had sustained her throughout 35 years of marriage to one of the most demanding men in the American military, stepped out onto the platform at every station and addressed the crowds in French, thanking them for honouring her husband. The grave at Ham has since become one of the most visited American military grave sites in Europe. Patton's headstone, identical. To those of the soldiers buried around him, stands at the head of the cemetery, as if the general is still leading his men in formation. The decision to leave him there among his troops rather than at a grand monument at home has come to symbolize his philosophy of leadership. Even in death, he remained with the soldiers he had commanded. For Beatrice Patton, the years after her husband's death were marked by purpose and, eventually, tragedy of her own. Born in 1886 to Frederick Eyre, a wealthy Boston industrialist who had made his fortune in textiles, Beatrice had grown up in privilege but had never been a passive observer of life. She spoke fluent French and had translated numerous French army manuals into English during the war. She was an accomplished equestrian, sailor, lecturer, and author of 3 books. Throughout Patton's career, she had been his confidant, his supporter, and occasionally his tempering influence during his many controversies. After Patton's death, Beatrice threw herself into advocacy. She became a forceful and persuasive speaker promoting universal military training, travelling the country to make the case for military preparedness in the emerging Cold War era. She guarded her husband's legacy fiercely, growing frustrated with the conspiracy theories that began to circulate about his death. Some claimed he had been assassinated by the Soviets, by his own government, by shadowy forces who feared his outspokenness about the communist threat. Beatrice dismissed these theories utterly. As her daughter Ruth Ellen later said, "He wasn't murdered. His time had come. When your time comes, it comes. There is no way out of it." The darker aspects of Patton's personal life surfaced after his death as well. His niece by marriage, Jan Gordon, had been a constant presence in the family. The daughter of Beatrice's half-sister Louise, Jan had been best friends with Ruth Ellen Patton since childhood and served as a bridesmaid at both Patton daughters' weddings. During the war, she worked as a Red Cross staff assistant in Europe, and her proximity to the general sparked rumours of a romantic relationship. The family was divided on the question. Some, including Ruth Ellen in her later memoirs, came to believe that her father and Jean had been involved. Others insisted the relationship was nothing more than a close familial bond. Patton's scholarly biographers have remained sceptical, with some suggesting that Patton, who was prone to boastfulness, may have exaggerated the nature of the relationship. What is certain is that Beatrice believed the rumours. Shortly after Patton's death, she arranged a meeting with Jean Gordon at a Boston hotel. The confrontation was brief and brutal. According to family accounts, Beatrice uttered a Hawaiian curse she had learned years earlier, wishing ill upon the younger woman. Just days later, in the early morning hours of 8th of January 1946, barely 2 weeks after Patton's death, Jan Gordon committed suicide in a Manhattan apartment. She was found on the floor in a negligee surrounded by pictures of the general, with gas hissing from the 4 open jets of a kitchen stove. She was 30 years old. The tragedy cast a pall over a family already reeling from loss. Yet Beatrice carried on. She lived for nearly 8 more years, maintaining the family estate at Green Meadows in South Hamilton, Massachusetts, and continuing her advocacy work. On 30th September 1953, while participating in a drag hunt with her brother at the Myopia Hunt Club, Beatrice suffered a ruptured aortic aneurysm. She fell from her horse and was pronounced dead upon arrival at Beverly Hospital. She was 67 years old. The equestrian who had shared her husband's passion for horses had died doing what she loved. Beatrice's wish to be buried with her husband was well known to her children. Unable to obtain official permission to inter her remains at the Luxembourg cemetery, they honoured her desire in their own way. After a brief Episcopal service, she was cremated. Some years after her death, her children scattered a portion of her ashes over Patton's grave in Ham. The remaining ashes were interred at the family property in Hamilton. In this way, Beatrice finally joined the husband she had loved, supported, and occasionally suffered for throughout their tumultuous marriage. The Pattons had 3 children. The eldest, Beatrice Patton, known as B to distinguish her from her mother, was born in 1911 at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. She married Lieutenant John K. Waters, a cavalry officer and West Point graduate, on 27 June 1934. The ceremony took place at St. John's Church in Beverly Farms, Massachusetts, with a reception at the Patton family home of Green Meadows. It was a union that would bring both distinction and heartbreak to the family. Waters rose through the ranks of the army, serving with distinction in North Africa during World War II. In February 1943, while commanding a tank unit in Tunisia, he was captured by German forces during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, when the German 10th Panzer Division overran American positions at Dejabel-la-Souda. He spent the next 2 years as a prisoner of war, eventually being held at Oflag the 25th B near Hammelburg, Germany. His imprisonment became the catalyst for one of the most controversial episodes of Patton's career. In late March 1945, as the Third Army pushed deep into Germany, Patton ordered a raid on the Hammelburg POW camp. Task Force Baum, as it came to be known, consisted of approximately 300 soldiers, 10 medium tanks, 6 light tanks, and various supporting vehicles. The mission was ostensibly to liberate the American prisoners held there, but the camp was 50 miles behind enemy lines, and the task force was vastly undersized for such an operation. The raid reached the camp on 27th of March, but was overwhelmed by German counterattacks. Nearly the entire task force was killed or captured. Waters himself was shot by a German guard while attempting to serve as an intermediary between the American raiders and the camp's defenders. He survived the wound, but spent additional weeks in captivity before being liberated. Patton publicly denied knowing that his son-in-law was held at Hammelburg when he ordered the raid. The claims strained credulity. Intelligence reports had indicated Waters' presence at the camp, and General Eisenhower was furious at the waste of men and equipment on what appeared to be a personal mission. The controversy damaged Patton's standing with his superiors and provided ammunition for those who questioned his judgment. Historians continue to debate his true motivations, but the episode illustrated the personal stakes that accompanied the Patton name even during the war. Waters recovered from his wounds and went on to a distinguished military career. He rose to the rank of 4-star general, serving as commander of U.S. Army Pacific from 1964 to 1966. His decorations included the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership of fellow prisoners, the Army Distinguished Service Medal, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart. But personal tragedy struck the Waters family as well. B. Patton Waters died of a heart attack on 24 October 1952 at their home near West Point. She was only 41 years old. At the time of her death, her husband was serving in Korea as Chief of Staff for I Corps. He learned of his wife's death from halfway around the world. Waters remarried and continued his service until his retirement. He died on 9th January 1989 at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. of heart failure. He was 82 years old. His 2 sons from his marriage to B, John Knight Waters Jr. and George Patton Waters, carried on the family's military tradition. The second Patton child, Ruth Ellen, was born in 1915 in Pasadena, California. Unlike her older sister, Ruth Ellen would live a long life devoted to preserving and interpreting the family's history. In 1940, she married James W. Totten, a career Army officer who would rise to the rank of Major General. Their marriage produced 3 children, Michael, James P. and Beatrice T. Britton. Like her mother, Ruth Ellen experienced life as an Army wife, moving frequently between posts in Hawaii, Panama, Turkey, Brazil, and Germany. Ruth Ellen became the unofficial historian of the Patton family. She supervised the collection and editing of family papers and collaborated extensively with biographers and historians seeking to understand her famous father. Her contributions were invaluable to Carlo D'Este, whose 1995 biography, Patton, A Genius for War, remains one of the definitive accounts of the general's life. D'Este first met Ruth Ellen in 1991 at the Green Meadows homestead, and their collaboration transformed his understanding of the complex man behind the legend. Ruth Ellen possessed a photographic memory that allowed her to recall conversations and events from decades past with remarkable precision. She shared freely with researchers, offering both the glowing tributes one might expect from a devoted daughter and the unflinching assessments of a woman who had witnessed her father's flaws as well as his genius. She believed passionately in reincarnation, a conviction she shared with both her parents, and approached death as merely a passage to a new existence. Beyond her family work, Ruth Ellen carved out her own intellectual territory. She became a noted speaker and essayist on subjects including the Salem witch trials, the customs of the American Plains Indians, and the life and last stand of Major General George Armstrong Custer. She conducted detailed research on the Battle of Little Bighorn, questioning conventional narratives about Custer's tactics and exploring why Native American warriors treated prisoners as they did. Her interests were eclectic and her knowledge formidable. In 1967, Ruth Ellen and her husband settled in South Hamilton, Massachusetts, near the family homestead. She founded the Army Distaff Foundation, an organization supporting military families, and wrote a cookbook called The Rolling Kitchen to benefit the group. She was active in the North Shore Garden Club, the Society of Colonial Dames, and the Daughters of the American Revolution. She maintained a lifelong interest in helping children with learning disabilities and served on the board of trustees of the Landmark School. Ruth Ellen began writing a biography of her mother, initially titled Ma, a Button Box Biography. The manuscript remained unpublished during her lifetime but was eventually released in 2005, more than a decade after her death, as The Button Box, a daughter's loving memoir of Mrs. George S. Patton. The book offered an intimate portrait of Beatrice Patton and, by extension, of the general himself, revealing aspects of his personality that previous biographers had been unable or unwilling to explore. Ruth Ellen's voice, passionate, insightful, and often hilarious, brought her mother to life and provided a window into a vanished world of cavalry posts, regimental balls, and the old army that had formed the core of American military leadership in World War II. Ruth Ellen Patton Totten died on Thanksgiving Day 1993 at her home in Hamilton. She was 78 years old. A memorial service was held at St. John's Episcopal Church in Beverly Farms, the same church where her parents had married in 1910. She left behind her brother George, her 3 children, and 6 grandchildren. Her contribution to the historical record ensured that the Patton story would be told not just as military history but as family saga. The youngest of the Patton children, and the one who bore the heaviest burden of the family name, was George Smith Patton IV. Born on Christmas Eve 1923 in Boston, he grew up in the shadow of a father who was already becoming a legend, the young. George entered West Point in 1942, just as his father was preparing to lead American forces into North Africa. The correspondence between them during this period, father at war, son at the military academy, reveals a relationship of deep affection and high expectation. Patton Sr. dispensed advice on duty, heroism, and honour with the same directness he used ordering the Third Army across Europe. The letters, many of which remained unpublished until 2012, show a man who was as engaged a parent as he was a military commander. George IV was still a cadet when his father died. He graduated from West Point in June 1946, just months after the general's burial in Luxembourg. At his graduation, an old veteran shook his hand and delivered a blunt assessment. "Well, George, you'll never be the man your father was, but congratulations." The pressure to live up to the family legend would define much of his life. Following his father's death, the younger Patton legally changed his name, dropping the Roman numerals that had distinguished him from his predecessors. Though technically the 4th George Smith Patton in the family line, his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father had all borne the name. He chose to be known simply as George Smith Patton. The decision reflected both his desire to honour his father and his determination to forge his own identity. George's military career would ultimately span 34 years and 3 major conflicts. His first assignment after graduation took him to Regensburg, West Germany, where he participated in the 1948 Berlin airlift. The troops under his command helped load supplies onto Air Force transport aircraft bound for the blockaded city. In 1951, he married Joanne Holbrook, a union that would last 52 years and produce 5 children. In February 1953, George deployed to Korea, commanding A Company of the 140th Tank Battalion, 40th Infantry Division. He received his first Silver Star and Purple Heart for his actions there, beginning a collection of decorations that would eventually rival his father's. After Korea, he was assigned to West Point and then, in an unusual exchange program, to teach at the United States Naval Academy, a rare honour for an Army officer. It was in Vietnam, however, that George Patton truly proved himself. He served 3 tours in that controversial conflict, the first from April 1962 to April 1963 at Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. During his final and most intense tour, from January 1968 to January 1969, he commanded the 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment, known as the Black Horse Regiment. He was wounded in combat and was shot down 3 times while using helicopters as a mobile command post. For his actions on the battlefield, he was awarded 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, the second highest decoration for combat valor in the U.S. Army, along with the Distinguished Flying Cross, additional Silver Stars, and more Purple Hearts. George Patton proved himself as brave, aggressive, and occasionally as controversial as his father had been. He developed a reputation for blunt speaking that echoed the old general's style. During his command of Semmelweis Corps in Germany, he confronted issues of racial integration head-on, declaring that anyone in his command who thought they had no race relations problem was, in his characteristic phrasing, deceiving themselves. He led from the front, just as his father had, and earned the fierce loyalty of the soldiers who served under him. One of the more remarkable relationships of George's later military career was his friendship with Manfred Rommel, the son of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had been his father's most respected adversary in North Africa. George was stationed near Stuttgart in the 1970s, where Manfred was serving as a government official who would later become the city's mayor. The 2 men discovered they shared a birthday, December 24th, and formed a bond that endured until George's death. The friendship between the sons of former enemies symbolized the reconciliation that had occurred between America and Germany in the post-war era. The Patton and Rommel families would spend Christmas Eves together, a tradition that would have been unimaginable during the war years. In 1975, George made military history when he assumed command of the 2nd Armored Division at Fort Hood, Texas, the same unit his father had first commanded before World War II. It was the first time in American military history that a son had taken command of a division previously led by his father. The moment represented both the culmination of a family tradition and the burden of constant comparison that George had carried throughout his career. George retired from the Army in 1980, after 34 years of service, having risen to the rank of Major General. Unlike his father, who had died longing for one more war to fight, George found peace in retirement. He settled at the family property in Hamilton, Massachusetts, transforming it into Green Meadows Farm, a working farm that grew blueberries, strawberries, and more than 200 varieties of produce. In a gesture that spoke to the losses that haunted him, he named the fields after soldiers who had died under his command in Vietnam. In 1986, tragedy struck the family when George accidentally set fire to the basement of his home. The blaze destroyed dozens of journals he had been keeping throughout his adult life, identical volumes bound in red canvas that contained his memories, reflections, and the raw material for the autobiography he had hoped to write. George suffered second-degree burns trying to rescue the journals, but nearly all of them were reduced to ash. The loss devastated him. His son Benjamin would later write that the burning of his office extinguished something in him. George worked to preserve his father's legacy, even as he struggled with his own. In 1997, he collaborated with author Brian Sobel on The Fighting Pattons, a book that served as both a family biography and a meditation on the evolution of military culture from his father's generation to his own. The book covered nearly 70 years of combined service across 5 conflicts. In his final years, George suffered from a degenerative form of Parkinson's disease. He died on 27 June 2004 at his home in Hamilton. He was 80 years old. A funeral for family and friends was held on 7 July at St. John's Episcopal Church in Beverly Farms, the same church where his grandparents had married, where his sister's memorial had been held, and where the Patton family had worshipped for generations. True to his wish to be buried among his soldiers, George was interred at Arlington National Cemetery on 27 August 2004. George and Joanne Patton had 5 children, each of whom chose their own path in relation to the family legacy. The eldest, Margaret Georgina Patton, became a Benedictine nun, taking the name Mother Margaret and living in a monastery in Bethlehem, Connecticut. Her choice of religious life represented a dramatic departure from the martial tradition of her forebears, yet it carried its own form of dedication and service. George S. Patton V, technically the 5th in the line but known simply as George Smith Patton Jr., remained in Hamilton, Massachusetts, carrying on the family presence in the region. He has given interviews for the History Channel and Military Channel, sharing memories of his grandfather and father and helping to keep the Patton legacy visible to new generations. Robert H. Patton became the family's literary voice. Unlike the previous George Pattons, he did not pursue a military career, becoming the first Patton male in 5 generations to break the pattern. Instead, he became a writer. In 1994, he published The Pattons, a personal history of an American family, drawing on letters, diaries, and personal documents, some more than 200 years old, to tell the story of his ancestors. The Washington Post called it one of the best books of the year. Robert's account revealed the inner man that only the family knew, the insecurity behind the bravado, the complex relationships with his wife and children, and the romance and horror of war as experienced by those who lived it. He has since written several other books, including Patriot Pirates, a history of Revolutionary War privateering. Helen Patton Plushik settled in Germany, where she has devoted her life to reconciliation and remembrance. She founded the Patton Stiftung Sustainable Trust in Saarbrücken and the Patton Foundation of Boston, organizations dedicated to keeping the memory of the greatest generation alive while helping contemporary soldiers and their families. She has produced documentaries, organized concerts commemorating D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, and facilitated reunions between concentration camp survivors and their liberators. Helen's connection to Germany runs deep and contains an extraordinary twist of fate. She married a German man named Thorsten Pluschek. After their marriage, they discovered that her grandfather had once rescued his grandfather, a German officer, from a Russian firing squad. The connection illustrated the strange intersections of history that the Patton family has repeatedly encountered. Helen has spoken openly about her grandfather's complexity, acknowledging both his genius and his flaws. She has discussed his alleged affair with John Gordon with a candor that previous generations avoided, accepting that love was important to my grandfather's ability to do his work, while recognizing the pain it caused her grandmother. In December 2005, Helen attended a ceremony in Mannheim, marking the 80th anniversary of her grandfather's accident. She unveiled a small sign at the intersection where the crash occurred, the first permanent marker at a site that had remained unmarked for 8 decades. 80 years later, your presence here proves that his legacy continues to resonate, she told the assembled crowd of American service members and German officials. Benjamin Wilson Patton, the youngest of George Thor's children, became a documentary filmmaker specializing in biographies for individuals and families. In 2012, he published Growing Up Patton, Reflections on Heroes, History and of Family Wisdom, a book that explored the correspondence between his grandfather and father during World War II, and reflected on what it meant to carry the Patton name. The book featured never-before-published letters and photographs, offering new insights into the relationship between the two generals. Benjamin's book also served as an act of recovery. After the 1986 fire destroyed his father's journals, Benjamin began recording oral histories with his father, capturing the stories and memories that might otherwise have been lost. The recordings formed the basis for much of Growing Up Patton and ensured that his father's experiences would survive for future generations. The Patton family story extends beyond the direct descendants of George S. Patton Jr. Ruth Ellen's children, Michael Totten, James Patton Totten, and Beatrice T. Britton carried on their mother's commitment to family history. James Patton Totten, a decorated Vietnam veteran himself, edited his mother's memoir for publication and wrote the introduction to The Button Box. The grandchildren of John K. Waters, including John Knight Waters Jr. and George Patton Waters, maintained the military tradition that had begun centuries earlier. The legacy of the Patton family is inseparable from the legacy of American military history itself. The Pattons trace their martial heritage back to the Revolutionary War, when Hugh Mercer, an ancestor who had fought with Bonnie Prince Charlie in Scotland before fleeing to the colonies, became a general in Washington's army. During the Civil War, George S. Patton Sr., the general's grandfather, commanded the 22nd Virginia Infantry for the Confederacy and was killed at the Battle of Winchester in 1864. The family's military tradition spans nearly 3 centuries and encompasses some of the most significant conflicts in American history. For the descendants of George S. Patton Jr., the challenge has always been to honor that tradition while finding their own paths. Some, like George IV, embraced the military life fully and proved themselves worthy heirs to the family name. Others, like Robert, chose different vocations while still engaging deeply with the family's history. Still others, like Mother Margaret, found meaning in forms of service that transcended the battlefield entirely. The question of what it means to be a Patton and whether anyone could ever truly live up to the legend of old blood and guts has haunted the family for generations. Benjamin Patton addressed this directly in Growing Up Patton, writing about the heavy rucksack of carrying the name and the constant comparisons that accompanied it. His father, George Thaddeus, spent his entire career being measured against a man he had barely known, a father who had been absent for most of his formative years, away at war, and who died before George could establish an adult relationship with him. Yet the family has largely avoided the pitfalls that have befallen other famous American dynasties. There have been no public scandals, no bitter feuds played out in the press, no attempts to exploit the family name for personal gain. The Pattons have, for the most part, conducted themselves with the dignity and discretion that Beatrice modelled in the years after her husband's death. They have cooperated with historians and biographers, opened family archives to researchers, and contributed their own memoirs and reflections to the historical record.